Hello viewers, welcome to week 4 lecture 1 of Swayam course on 20th century literary criticism and theory part 1. I am Ashish Kumar Pathak, assistant professor, Department of English, Banaras Hindu University, and in this lecture I will be talking about Viktor Shklovsky and how Russian formalists approach poetry. What are their methods and tools that they develop for the analysis of a poetic discourse. Like in the previous lectures, we are introduced to various concepts of Russian formalism. We will be looking at those concepts in detail here. So, for example, Shklovsky is a very important proponent of this movement called Russian formalism. And as we know that how 1914, the year in which Opoyaz, the Society for the Study of Poetic Language, was established in 1914, right? During the same year, he wrote an essay, The Resurrection of Word, right? So, another important essay which is very popular or very famous is Art as Technique, written by Shklovsky. There he says, he gives several citations from the symbolist critic Potevannya to the effect that art is nothing but imagery. As we have already seen that how Russian formalists, they reacted against this exclusive focus on imagery as the chief literary device, of which A. Potevannya was a chief exemplar, and that symbolist tradition. Russian formalists were against that. They set themselves in opposition to that. And Shklovsky writes, art is thinking in images. Without image, there is no art, and in particular, no poetry. So here we find that how Potevannya says that the entire artistic process is centered on imagery. We cannot think of anything beyond the use of imagery, right? And further, Potevannya goes to say that an image is far clearer and simple than what it clarifies. So we must be more familiar with the image than with what it clarifies, right? However, Shklovsky says that the poetic image is only one of the ways of creating a perceptible structure or design to be experienced within its own very fabric. For example, Shklovsky goes on to say that in poetry, imagery is not the only device by which literariness is generated, by which this literary quality in a poem is generated. He goes on to say that there are other devices like sound patterns or rhythm which are very instrumental in making a poetic discourse. And in this way, we have already seen that in context of this point, how Russian formalists are distinguished from the new critics, right? So, these Russian formalists, they do not deny the importance of imagery in poetry, but they do not also ascribe to it the exclusive value that had been set on it by the symbolists and the new critics. So, it is for the first time we see that in the field of literary discussion, how the romantic hegemony of imagery has been questioned and challenged. So, even if we look at new criticism, it can be seen is in continuation with that romantic focus on imagery. They of course, stand against this focus on the content, but somehow their obsession with imagery is very much there, right? So, the other important thing about the Russian formalists, that they not only say that there are other literary devices such as rhythm or sound pattern which creates or generates literariness, they also make a distinction between the prosaic image and the poetic image. It is a very significant contribution of the Russian formalists, and it is something which makes them unique, right? They say, Viktor Shklovsky writes that Potemnia did not distinguish between the language of poetry and the language of prose. Consequently, he ignored the fact that there are two aspects of imagery: imagery as a practical means of thinking, as a means of placing objects within categories, and images as poetic, as a means of reinforcing an impression. For example, to make this distinction between prosaic image and poetic image, Shlovatsky, draws our attention towards a situation where he says that suppose there is a young boy who is eating bread and butter, right? And his fingers are smeared with butter on it. So if somebody calls him that, hey, butterfingers, so this is one kind of expression, and Shlovatsky says that this may be taken as a prosaic expression. The other kind of, look at another kind of situation. Suppose a boy is playing with spectacles. The spectacle falls down and the person addresses the boy as, hey, butterfingers, right? If we look at the two situations, so they say that language is same, but how at one place the image is prosaic image, because if the boy is eating butter and naturally his fingers are smeared with butter, so there is nothing extraordinary about that. We say, hey, butterfingers, so it is very obvious, it is very ordinary statement. But if he is playing with something like spectacles and the spectacle falls down, so there if you say, hey, butterfingers, so the concept is quite extraordinary, because you make distinction that his hands are very slippery and therefore the spectacles fell off his hand. So there how foregrounding is done, how de-automatization of is done, right? So this is how you notice it. The Russian formalists also say that other than imagery, sound pattern is also the crux of poetry. Poetic discourses are noted because of their specific phonic dimension, right? The way we use sound pattern in a poetic discourse, it is generally not used in ordinary discourse. They say that even an ordinary discourse may have its phonic dimension, may have a different kind of sound pattern, may have a rhythmical movement. However, in poetry, it is quite different, highly repetitious, and in this way, sound patterns are very important, right? So in this way, we find that the general thrust of their arguments is that words in practical language are a means of communication, whereas in poetry, they are important less for their meaning than for their sound pattern. And in this way, Shlovatsky talks about this idea of defamiliarization, or what he also calls laying bare, right? So defamiliarization is also a tool which is used to generate literariness in a work of art, right? So when these formalists are setting forth the principle of defamiliarization, we can see that how they were setting themselves in opposition to the symbolist critics, particularly Potemnia, who believed in language's role in making familiar what is strange and unfamiliar. So for Potemnia, what he wants to say that what is the role of imagery? The role of imagery is to make something clear which is not clear. It is to make something familiarized which is already defamiliarized, while the Russian formalist, particularly Shlovatsky, takes an opposite stand, right? So these formalists argued with considered emphasis that literariness is defamiliarization in all forms of literature. And the role of image is to defamiliarize the experience, not to familiarize the experience, to make things not clear but rather ambiguous, right? Shlovatsky writes, art exists that one may recover the sensation of life. It exists to make one feel things, to make the stone stony. The purpose of art is to impart sensation of things as they are perceived and not as they are known. The technique of art is to make objects familiar to make forms difficult, to increase the difficulty and length of perception. Art is a way of experiencing the artfulness of an object. The object is not important, right? So here we find that what he wants to say, he makes a distinction between perceiving and knowing and recognizing, right? He says that what is the purpose of art? For example, it makes to feel stone stony. I mean, how objects they are. It makes you stand and stare at the objects. Therefore, art uses repetitive devices. For example, in poetry, there may be one point that the poet has to make. But to make that point, he takes help of many repetitious patterns, rhythms. So, we look at that things with more concentration. In this way, what Ransom says, we feel the thingness of things, right? So, in this way, we find that how Shklovsky offers a perceptive account of the nature and function of literature and how it differs from what is not literature, right? So, he takes into consideration the overall effect that literature produces and the methods and techniques used to embody that effect in a literary construct, right? So, in this way, he distinguishes between perceiving, knowing and recognizing. He says that outside literature, we see things, but we do not feel them. Inside literature, we feel them, right? So, we get the abstract idea of an object outside literary world. But in literary world, we get objects in all its particularity. That is what he means by making us feel a stone stony, feeling the thingness of things, right? So, in this way, Jakobson has distinguished between naming an object and presenting an object. In literary art, we name an object, right? So, in poetry, name becomes the object in order to present the object. We pick up a far-fetched word which is forced into service. So, in this way, he says that in order to recover the particularity of individual objects and sensation of life, which is lost in automatism, the writer employs the technique of defamiliarization, which makes one pause and perceive, stand and stare, right? So, the technique of art impedes perception, makes one stand and stare. It is the artfulness of an object that renders aesthetic pleasure. So, in this way, how he correlates this aesthetic pleasure with defamiliarization. In this way, defamiliarization is performing an aesthetic function, right? For example, he gives various examples from our life, right? For example, he says that for the first time, if a boy picks up a pen to write something, he feels a kind of sensation. But what happens? After you start writing in the same way over years, we hardly feel that writing with pen, writing something is an extraordinary activity. For the first time, we start learning a foreign language. For the first time, we start riding a bicycle. What kind of enthusiasm it is there, right? For the first time, we learn driving. What kind of sensation it gives us, how carefully we are that noises should not distract us, how careful we should be on all the devices in a vehicle. But with the passage of time, what happens? Automatization engulfs that sensation. And that happens in our real life as well, that every day we go through the same path. There may be some beautiful daffodils, there may be some beautiful flowers, there may be a beautiful spectacle of nature, there may be an extraordinary sight. But because we pass through that sight every day, we do driving every day, we do writing every day, we speak foreign tongue every day, all these things, sensation of things are lost in automatization. Things become automatic, therefore they do not appeal to us. We do not feel sensation. The task of poetry is to recover sensation in life. And how that sensation is recovered? By this element of defamiliarization. Therefore, when we read a work of art, for example, you read a poem by Wordsworth, Daffodils, Daffodils are flowers that we see every day around, but when we read that poem, a unique sensation is imparted to us. There lies this unique function of art that is based on defamiliarization, or that is based on this unique artistic function, or what we call aesthetic function. Right, in his famous essay, Resurrection of the Word, Shklovsky tells us what happens when we become familiar with things. He says, we do not see the familiar, we do not see it, but recognize it. We do not see the walls of our rooms. It is so hard for us to spot a misprint in the proof, particularly if it is written in a language well known to us, because we cannot make ourselves see and read through and not recognize the familiar word. Right? So, in this way, he says that in poetry, practical language is deformed for the sake of rhythm. Right? So, ordinary language, its order is disrupted because we have to achieve a rhythm. Therefore, repetitious words are found, and in this way, normal logic of syntax, normal rules of language, laws of sentence formation, they are disrupted. And in this way, when they are disrupted, this very quality draws the attention towards itself. Right, so granted that practical language also has a rhythm of its own, this rhythm is produced automatically by the nature of language, and our ears are so attuned to it that we do not pay attention to it, any special attention. Right, so for example, in his essay on Potenya, Shklovsky shifts emphasis from imagery as it is idealized by the symbolist to sound pattern. He says that poetic language is distinguished from practical language by the perception of its structure. Sometimes one feels the verbal structure, the arrangement of words rather than texture. Right, so Shklovsky means by structure the sound pattern of language. By texture, he means the content of language, the semantic content of poetry, or what is called imagery and the meaning generated by imagery, and the relationship of that image with the other devices which have been used in that poem. Right, so he says that many times meaning of poetry is felt through its sound pattern, through its rhythm. So, in this way, Shklovsky is able to assert this point that a poetry is poetry because of its rhythmical pattern, because of its unique sound pattern. Otherwise, there is no distinction between poetry and ordinary language. We can use imagery in ordinary language. We can use imagery in prosaic language as well. So, imagery cannot be the solely defining feature of poetry, right? So, literariness is primarily generated by various sound patterns that we find in poetry, or various rhyme schemes or rhythmical language. For example, he gives names of other critics who have paid attention to the phonic dimension of poetry and how it goes into generating literariness. Right. So, for example, Leo Jakubinski on the sounds of poetic language, Osip Brick, sound repetitions, Boris Tomasvsky's The Problem of Poetic Rhythm, and book-length studies of Boris Tomasvsky and Thomas Eichenbaum. They closely examine the nature and function of sound pattern as well as independent value of sound in poetry. For example, in his essay on poetry and nonsense language, Shklovsky wonders whether meaning in poetry is always necessary and opines the belief that words always have a meaning in poetic speech is a fiction. The Russian formalist anticipated the position of Archibald MacLeish in his well-known utterance that poetry should not mean but be. So, in this way, the argument of these Russian formalists is that sometimes poetry can be written with nonsensical words as well, because in poetry, meaning is not important. They have already talked about that any literary discourse, whether it is poetic discourse or prosaic discourse, the primary function of that literary discourse is not to communicate anything. Because if you have to make a communication, you have your language available at your disposal. You can use it for ordinary communication. What is the use of poetry? So you use poetry not for making any kind of communication necessarily. Rather, it foregrounds its own aesthetic function. So therefore, he goes on to say that a poem can be written with the help of absolutely nonsensical words, right? Provided it has a rhythm, it has a rhyme scheme, it has a unique sound pattern which is quite different from ordinary language. And in this way, they affirm the position of Archibald Macleish that a poem should not mean, rather it should be. Right. So here we find that for the Russian formalists, the sound pattern calls for an order of words which is different from one in practical language. And they say that devices like alliteration, assonance, consonance, rhyme scheme, they all depend on the sound and placement of words. Right. Further, they say that versification, which is based primarily on the rhythmical pattern generated by the sounds of words, requires the arrangement of words in a particular order and the choice of words for their sound rather than meaning. So, it is not meaning which governs the arrangement of words, rather sound pattern. And in this way, metrical forms can be fully realized with nonsense words, provided they have necessary sounds, which is to say that the inalienable character of poetry is phonic rather than semantic. Hence, the observation that poetic speech is organized in terms of its sounds is something that defines Russian formalist approach towards literature. And in this way, they are very different from new critics or symbolist critics, in the sense that they do not focus on imagery, they do not give priority to imagery over the phonic dimension of poetry. So, in this way, viewers, I come to the end of this lecture, and we have analyzed formalist approach to poetry. In the next lecture, we will be analyzing Russian formalist approach to prose fiction in detail. Thank you.